Welcome back. This is going to be a post-election update and some other issues. Just after the election, I had a very important family member die, and it was highly traumatic. Not so much for me, but for many of the other members of my family. And the guy who died, he was a true Aryan, and he was a pillar for his community, and he was a river to his people. He was a very generous man. So he had a lot of good traits, is what I'm trying to say. And he was killed by basically this modern world that we live in, and I guess you would have to say his own weakness as a result of the pain of living in this world, and specifically a result of bad diet, drinking too much, not taking care of his health. And so this guy passed away in his middle 50s, and he had 3 or 4 grandchildren, and he won't live to see those kids grow up, and he won't be able to pass on his accumulated knowledge and wisdom, of which he had a great deal. He was one of the smarter guys, most intelligent guys in his peer group, in his generation, highly capable, great work ethic, just a very important and valuable person in his community, and now he's dead. And he's dead because he didn't take care of his health. And so, whether you think it occurred over a couple of million years or a few tens of thousands of years or just 6,000 years, whatever you think, we as human beings and as white European Western Aryan people adapted to certain conditions. And for most of those conditions, most of that time period that we've existed, food was not that plentiful. And if you didn't occupy an important social position or you weren't capable, you ran a real risk of starving, or at least having so little food that you either could not reproduce properly or you were just a marginal organism in the social body, marginal part of it. And so now we live, thanks to, as I understand it, thanks to the Rockefeller, Anglo-American, Judeo-Masonic elite. They funded a thing called the Green Revolution. So in the 1960s, chemical fertilizers, which had been invented, I think, in Germany in the 19 teens and 20s, were combined with revolutionary breeding patterns in crops like wheat and corn, maize, to produce a gigantic world surplus of food. And so we still have distribution issues, and that's why people starve to death across the world. But in terms of the overall production of calories, we, I think for the first time in human history, or at least civilized human history, we produce more than we need. And this means that food is very cheap. It's particularly cheap in modern Western countries because the government subsidizes the production of food and then distributes it. They pay the farmers to overproduce, and then they buy it, and then they distribute it to the underclass. So in a Western country, and then they have social welfare on top of all this. So in a Western country, if you're starving or you don't have enough food, there's something seriously wrong with you or your social situation, rather than just people not being able to produce enough, which was the problem throughout most of our history. What this means is that the conditions under which we adapted are no longer, they don't hold anymore. So these Darwinian conditions of fight to live don't exist, and so that's part of the problem. We've got too much food. A lot of it's low quality. It's not very good food. It's just, as they say, empty calories. So you have a lot of carbohydrates and fats, not good protein, not much protein or not good protein. And as Jonathan Bowden says, a lot of it is chemicals and gas rather than real food. Because of the alchemy, because of the alchemical things that are done to food. At any rate, that's part of the problem, is we got too much food and it's not very good and it's really cheap. The other problem is that the modern world is, an intellectual and moral wasteland. And I'm not going to go through the litany You can go look for yourself at any of our right-wing websites or news aggregators, and you can see the continual and justified outrage over the latest degeneracy and filth. And you can think about people in your own family or in other parts of the country where we have serious drug problems. In my area, we have a lot of marijuana usage, and alcohol usage, which at this point, that's bad enough, but it has taken second and third place relatively, comparatively to methamphetamine problems. So you've got these people who are in the IQ range of something like 95 to 105, and they are conditioned by their social structure to constantly be in a state of sexual excitation and materialism. They are deprived of their natural community leaders and shepherds. There's no religion left, and then on top of that, you give them methamphetamine. So it's a really despicable situation for a lot of these people. And we're not in a situation to help them as much as we want to because we don't have any money. And as soon as you start to do it, you're branded a radical or an extremist or an anti-Semite, which are all correct. But it limits our ability to say what we need to say to people in the public sphere because you get completely shut out. Okay, so what am I trying to say here? We've got too much food, it's too cheap, it's not very good, and the modern world is a despicable place. So people are unhappy. And when you're unhappy, one of the things that you can do is you can eat and eat and eat. And it makes you feel better in the short term. But in the long term, it destroys your health. Puts a great strain on your organs, prematurely ages you, reduces your mobility, does a lot of bad things to you. And so it can even kill you. It can even take 20 years off your life and cause you to have a heart attack in your middle 50s so that you don't get to see your grandchildren grow up. So my public service announcement to all of you is please take care of your health and try to do the same for your family members. You can't really convince people to eat properly and exercise and take care of themselves. You can't force them to do it, but you can maybe provide a good example, which is some of the best things that we can do anyway is turning inward and focusing on self-improvement and then providing an alternative moral structure and role model for people. Sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before they can have a reason to start looking for an alternative, but at least we can provide that. Okay, so I'm going to pause this and then we'll talk about the election, post-election stuff. Okay, so I plan on titling this video "The Two Frauds." And everybody, I think, who's on the internet has seen the claims about the first of these two frauds. And this is the idea that during the night of the election, well, let me back up and I'll just talk about my own experiences on election day. So I worked the polls in my precinct on election day. I got there at about 5 o'clock in the morning and I didn't get to leave until after 9 p.m. So it was a very long day. And I did probably 80% of the work at my precinct, which I was the only male there and I was the only young person there. Everybody else I worked with was, over 60 years old and female. And also all the people who were working there, both, citizens like myself and people from the government apparatus, the government people, cops and otherwise, everybody there, they're all absolutely terrified of taking any responsibility or initiative for anything. And they're also quite slow in every regard. And so the result is that these lines that you see going out the door, at least in my area, are due to, having like the least efficient people working the system. So anyhow, I ended up doing the majority of the work because I can't stand that kind of inefficiency. It disgusts me. And they were happy to let me do it because several of them, most of them are quite lazy, in fact. So I ended up doing the bulk of the work that day, which in my state, people come in They present you with a photo ID. You look at the logbook, which is the number of people who are registered to vote in that precinct. They don't register that day. They have to register in advance. You use their photo ID to verify the information that they are the person on the ID. They look like this person, and then the information on the ID is in the logbook. So then you have them sign the book, and then they go to the voting machine, and then they vote. The voting machines are programmed with, well, they have their mechanical and electronical device, quite large. They have firmware and software on them, and they're set up for 2 or 3 different kinds of ballots based on the person in your precinct, where they live. So do they live in city limits? Do they live in the county? What's their status in terms of this, that, or the other? And then they have 2 or 3 different ballots that they'll be assigned to one of these, and they'll vote in that way. And so, just for example, if they're in the city limits, they vote on the municipal stuff as well as the presidential election, the county races, constitutional amendments, whatever it happens to be that's on there. So we did this, and I think I registered about 800 people, something like 700 or 800 people. And at the end of the day, I looked, you can look at the logbook and you can see how many people have already voted absentee or mail-in ballots or whatever it is. Weren't very many of them. There were not very many. Almost everybody chose to vote in person. Now, and the turnout was extremely high. Now, my voting precinct is about 50-50 white and black. So you've got about half of the people are white, most of them are Republicans, and then the other half of the people are Democrat or blacks, and most of them are Democrats. So after signing all these people in, seeing who was voting that day, and then at the end of the day, the voting machine gives you 2 things. It gives you a paper printout of the vote totals from that particular machine. And the vote totals for each machine are the same because it's the precinct and people are randomly being assigned to machine 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you get basically the exact same results from all the different machines, from the 4 different machines for that precinct. You get paper totals from each machine that show you how many people voted in each of these things. And then you get a glorified flash drive that comes out of the machine that you then send off to your county officials, who then send that off to the Secretary of State, and then you get results reported for the whole state by this way. So what we got was a blowout in my precinct for Trump, and very few votes for Biden. He underperformed in my precinct. And so since the precinct is 50-50 white-black, I said to myself and to my old lady, my wife, as soon as I got home, I said, Trump's won this thing. It's over. Because whatever happened in my precinct, even though I'm in the Deep South and I'm in a Republican white area, overall, the larger area, the state and elsewhere, I knew that if he performed that well here, he's going to do good in Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, whatever. So I said, it's over. He's won. And then I looked at the results online, and it confirmed my suspicions. He was leading in all those swing states. So I went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and it was a completely different election, as you well know. So we won't get into all that. But the way that changed, obviously, was fraud. I don't really see any other way to explain it. And the particular examples of the fraud that are so obvious, I haven't seen any substantive objection to these things from the other side. All of the objections are very generalized, they're non-specific, and so it leads me to believe that the objections, there's nothing to them. And basic common sense will tell you that something fraudulent occurred. So that's the first fraud. The second fraud, and the more important one by far, I would say, is this notion of parliamentarism and liberal democracy. And this is more important than the fraud that's done in one particular election. We're not going to make any political progress in this country and in the West as a whole until our people start to recognize that the entire liberal democratic system is a giant fraud and shell game. And so it was my claim before the election, in that video I recorded, that this is what we need. I didn't make a prediction. I said, this is what I want to happen, and I'm getting exactly what I wanted. The three fundamental tenets of the NSDAP program, I'm not going to say what the other two are, but one of them was anti-parliamentarism or anti-liberal democracy. And so we've got to establish that tenet at least throughout probably, I would say, a quarter of our people. At least a quarter of our people need to firmly believe that liberal democracy is broken and that something else has to happen. And so we're making a lot of progress in that regard, as you well know. The poll numbers that I've seen say that something like 75% of Republican voters, these are almost all white people, middle-class white people, they believe that the election was a fraudulent election. So we're making very good progress in this regard. I don't have much hope that Trump will win, by which I mean be seated for a second term, and I don't really care if he is anyway. I'm not really too interested in that. What I do want is for him to fight as hard as he possibly can, push the boundaries as far as he possibly can, and then I'm sure that he'll lose because what he has chosen to do is to battle his enemies, which are overwhelmingly strong. Unreal strength comes from this structure. He's chosen to fight them on their own ground, which are in the courts and in the public opinion, i.e. the media. And so even though I'm sure a majority of people in the country believe that the election was either fraudulent or suspect, and you even see this from people on the political left who I won't name, but prominent homosexual American expatriates in Brazil, for instance, those type of people even have very strong opinions about this election. So I think a majority of people probably believe something's wrong and it should be looked into, but it's not. They're not going to do anything about it. So this is how can you fight a PR campaign when your opponent controls all the media? You just can't do it. How can you fight a legal campaign when your opponents control the judiciaries? The trial lawyers are overwhelmingly leftist, liberal, Democrat, progressive, Marxist. How can you do it? I just don't think you can. The Supreme Court's what a lot of people hang their hats on, and I've said before and I'll say it again, the Supreme Court of the United States has been either a tool of the left and the elite, or it's been cowed into submission. And that happened first under FDR, in which he threatened to pack the court. So they said, okay, all your programs are constitutional. We knew they weren't constitutional until you threatened us. Now they're constitutional. Well, once you've done that, that institution's kind of dead. It's over. Its power is destroyed. And that's what they do half the time. So they just allow things that are unconstitutional. The other half of the time, like under the Warren Court, they actively promote whatever can't get through the legislature or the executive. So when the other two branches of government are too weak or cowardly to push through some, extreme left program, the court just does it for them. This is how we got gay marriage. This is how we got so-called civil rights, the civil rights revolution, abortion. All this stuff is done with the court. So for people to think that somehow the elite is going to, shoot itself in the foot by having the Supreme Court overrule a fraudulent election, I don't see it, guys. I just don't. I could be wrong, but I think that's a lot of wishful thinking. I think they will decline to take the case, or if they take the case, there will be a narrow 5-4 majority for saying that we would maybe like to do something, because democratic legitimacy is very important, but it would be even worse to overturn the results of the election, so we're just going to let it stand. And honestly, those outcomes are not bad for us because they do what we need, which is eroding the legitimacy of this disgusting, vile, hateful, destructive system. That's what we have to do. That's what we have to achieve to move on to anything. To have any better outcome in the future, we have got to get away from the idea that donating to these Republican political candidates who are pro-business and promote, neoconservative corporatism, which is basically the idea behind the Republican Party, or, to oppose, neoliberal globalist corporatism in the Democratic Party. None of that shit's going to work. It's just a waste of time. So, I don't know if I need to say anything else about the election. I've got the book on the Spanish Civil War, prior to the Spanish Civil War. Still working on that. Got a couple of other topics. Still want to talk about Wendell Willkie and the 1940 Republican National Convention. Want to talk to you about Lawrence Dennis and him and Maximilian J. St. George, their book, A Trial on Trial. And I want to talk to you about the IPR and Bruno Lasker and several other important issues. But we've just got to find the time. Thanks, guys. Oh, last thing. Sorry I haven't responded to everybody's comments. I know I've got some outstanding. I try to read them all, try to respond to everything, but I really do appreciate I appreciate all you guys. Thanks.